I once ruled an empire that stretched from Madrid to Moscow, crowned by the Pope's own hand. I died a prisoner on a volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean, and for 19 years, they wouldn't even carve my name on my own grave. Hi, I'm Robert, and today I'm going to tell you the complete story of Napoleon Bonaparte, through his own eyes, from a boy on a Corsican beach to an emperor with no name on his own tombstone. I was born on Corsica in the town of Ajaccio in 1769, the same year France finally annexed the island, which meant I was born French by exactly 1 year's accident of timing and never entirely stopped feeling like an outsider because of it. As a boy, I used to sit on the rocks above the sea with a wooden sword, staring toward the coast of a country I hadn't yet decided whether to think of as mine. I was small, stubborn, and already more interested in maps and numbers than in most of what interested other boys my age. Nobody who knew that child would have predicted an empire. I'm not sure I would have believed it myself. At the military academy of Brienne, the sons of old noble families mocked my accent, my threadbare uniform, and the island I came from, which most of them had never even heard of before I arrived. I did not fight back with my fists. I found the one subject where an accent meant nothing at all: mathematics. Artillery, it turns out, does not care what a man sounds like when he calculates the arc of a cannonball. I spent long winter nights alone with chalk and a blackboard, mastering ballistics and the movements of armies on paper, while the boys who mocked me were at dinner, laughing at a joke they thought was still funny. By the time I left Brienne for the military school in Paris, I had already decided something the other cadets hadn't: that a man's birth might decide where he starts, but it would not decide where he finishes. My real chance came in 1793 at the port of Toulon, held by royalist rebels and the British fleet against the young French Republic. I was 24, a junior artillery officer nobody in Paris had heard of, and I proposed a plan the senior commanders had overlooked entirely: take the high ground overlooking the harbor, and no ship in that fleet would be safe at anchor. They gave me the guns. I directed the fire myself. Night after night, on batteries I trusted no one else to aim as precisely as I could. Within weeks the British evacuated, the port fell, and I went from an anonymous captain to a brigadier general almost overnight. I was 24 years old. I had learned, more or less permanently, that the fastest way to be taken seriously was to be right about something no one else had bothered to calculate. Back in Paris, at a crowded salon full of a kind of effortless elegance I had never learned and never entirely trusted, I felt more out of place than I had at any battle. I arrived awkward, undecorated by the standards of that room, aware that half the guests were quietly measuring exactly how much attention I deserved. Then I noticed a woman across the room, watching me over a fan with an expression I couldn't quite read: amused, appraising, unbothered by my discomfort. Her name was Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow whose first husband had been executed in the Terror, 6 years older than me and infinitely more at ease in rooms like that one than I would ever be. She approached me, not the other way around, and I said something clumsy and overly direct about her eyes that should have embarrassed me, and somehow didn't. I had commanded artillery under fire without hesitation. I did not think I had ever been as nervous as I was crossing that room toward her, or as certain, almost immediately, of what I wanted next. 5 years later, I was leading an army through Egypt, in the shadow of monuments already 3,000 years old when Rome was young. I told my soldiers, before one battle near the pyramids, that 40 centuries were looking down on them. I wanted them to feel the weight of history, the same weight I had felt as a boy staring at a coastline I couldn't yet claim. I will not pretend that campaign was clean or without its darker chapters. War in a foreign land rarely is. But it was in Egypt that Europe first understood I could win far from home, without Paris looking over my shoulder, which mattered more to my career than any of the treasures we cataloged there. By December of 1804, I had risen far enough that Pope Pius VII himself agreed to travel to Notre Dame to crown me Emperor of the French. When the moment came, I reached out and took the crown from his hands before he could place it on my head, and crown myself instead. I said, afterward, that I found the crown of France lying in the gutter, and picked it up myself with the point of my sword. It was not entirely modest of me. It was, however, entirely true. Then I turned and crowned Josephine Empress with my own hands, in front of everyone in that cathedral who had ever doubted either of us belonged there. My greatest victory came less than a year later, at Austerlitz, against the combined armies of Russia and Austria. I had studied the ground for days, and I deliberately weakened one flank to bait them into attacking it, certain they would take what looked like an opportunity. That morning, fog lay so thick over the battlefield that neither army could see the other clearly. And then, as I gave the order to advance, the sun broke through it almost exactly on cue. My men called it the sun of Austerlitz afterward, as though I had arranged the weather along with the battle plan. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. My own official report claimed that thousands of retreating enemy soldiers drowned when our cannon fire broke the ice beneath them on a frozen lake. Historians since have found the true number was almost certainly far smaller than I claimed. I was not above improving a victory that was already, on its own, the best day of my military life. By 1809, I had an empire but no heir, and an empire without an heir is just a war other men will fight over the moment I am gone. Josephine had given me over a decade of marriage. I do not think I ever stopped loving, but she could not give me a son, and I convinced myself that duty to France had to matter more than my own attachments. In the great hall of the Tuileries, in front of our whole assembled family, I told her the marriage would be dissolved. She wept, not performing it, not for the room, but genuinely. And for once in my life, I did not have a speech ready. I kept her title of Empress. I kept paying her debts for the rest of her life without being asked to. None of that made the hall feel any less cold on the walk back to my own rooms alone. I married an Austrian archduchess within the year and had my son. I'm not certain, even now, that I got the trade right. 3 years later, I made the worst decision of my life. I invaded Russia with the largest army Europe had ever assembled, over 400,000 men, certain that speed and numbers would force the Tsar to negotiate before winter came. We marched for months through a country that seemed to retreat ahead of us on purpose, burning its own fields and villages rather than let us live off them. The first snow fell far earlier in the season than any of my generals had planned for, and I remember watching it land on my sleeve and thinking, for the first time since I was a young officer at Toulon, that I might have miscalculated something no one had bothered to warn me about. I reached Moscow in September and found it already burning, set alight rather than surrendered to me. The Russians had abandoned their own capital and put to the torch sooner than hand it to me intact. I stood in a doorway watching the fires and thinking, I have conquered a graveyard. There was nothing left in that city to feed an army of 400,000 men, and no czar willing to negotiate with a conqueror holding nothing but ashes. I waited 5 weeks for a peace offer that never came, ruling a court that had fled in a city that was no longer a city at all. So we turned back into a winter that killed far more of my men than any Russian army had. I watched soldiers who had followed me through Egypt and Austerlitz collapse into snowdrifts they never stood up from again. Watched horses freeze standing upright. Watched an army that had once seemed unstoppable reduced to a column of frostbitten men trudging past their own dead. Of the 400,000 who marched into Russia with me, fewer than 40,000 marched out as a fighting force. I said once on that retreat that there's only one step from the sublime to the ridiculous. I meant it about myself as much as anyone. I had gone from the man crowned by the Pope to the man walking away from his own ruined army in the snow, and the distance between those two men was exactly one winter. By April of 1814, with Paris fallen and my own marshals no longer willing to fight for me, I abdicated and was exiled to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy, barely large enough to ride across in a day. The victorious powers let me keep the title of emperor, as though that were a kindness, and gave me sovereignty over a rock with a few thousand pebble farmers on it. I reorganized its roads, its mines, its little army of a few hundred men because I did not know how to be a man who did not organize something. But I was not built for a small island, and everyone who watched me pace along its shoreline that year, including the British officers sent to keep an eye on me, seemed to understand I was not finished yet. In February of 1815, after less than a year on Elba, I sailed back to France with barely 1,000 men and landed near Cannes. The government in Paris sent a regiment to arrest me before I could get near the capital. We met them on the road outside Grenoble, my little column facing soldiers under orders to shoot me on sight. I walked forward alone, opened my coat, and told them, "If any man among you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." Nobody fired. For a moment that felt much longer than it was, the only sound was wind. And then the whole regiment broke ranks and came running toward me, shouting that they'd rather die for me than against me. I had not fired a single shot to begin retaking an empire. It lasted 100 days. On the 18th of June, near a village called Waterloo, I met the Duke of Wellington's army on ground, turned to mud by a night of rain that slowed my artillery for hours I could not afford to lose. I was in genuine physical pain that day. Illness, of all the undignified things history rarely mentions about its battles, and it may have cost me time I badly needed. I was counting on reinforcements reaching the field before Wellington's did. It was the Prussians, not mine, who arrived first, slamming into my flank in the early evening and breaking what was left of my army's discipline. I had won so many battles by making the other side collapse before I did. That evening, for the last time, I was the one who collapsed. I abdicated a second time, 4 days later. This time, there would be no return. The British were not going to make the same mistake twice. This time they sent me to St. Helena, a volcanic speck of an island in the middle of the South Atlantic, over 1,000 miles from the nearest coastline in any direction, and appointed a governor named Hudson Lowe to guard me, whose entire personality seemed built around making sure I understood exactly how finished I was. He restricted my letters, counted my visitors, and referred to me, pointedly, only as General Bonaparte, never Emperor, never even by my first name. A small daily insult he clearly relished. I spent my last years at a damp, isolated house called Longwood, dictating my memoirs to whichever loyal companions had followed me into that exile, trying to make sure that whatever else the world decided about me, it would at least have my own version of the story to argue with. My health failed slowly and then quickly through 1820 and into the early months of 1821. Stomach pain, weight loss, the kind of decline my doctors argued about without ever quite agreeing on a cause. Some have since suspected poison. Most historians now believe it was stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed my father. I will let people who study such things keep arguing about it. I died on the 5th of May, 1821, in a small room at Longwood, with a handful of companions and servants at my bedside instead of the armies and courts I'd spent my life surrounded by. I am told my last words drifted between the names of old battles and the name Josephine, though I will admit I cannot vouch for what a dying man is reported to have said any better than anyone else can. They buried me on that island, beneath a willow tree, in a grave the British and French governments could not even agree on how to inscribe. The British wanted Napoleon Bonaparte. The French insisted on simply Napoleon, the name of an emperor, not a general. Neither side would yield. So for 19 years my headstone carried no name at all, just blank stone over a man the whole world still had an opinion about. In 1840, they finally brought me home, to Paris, to a tomb built for an emperor after all. I left Corsica as a boy nobody would have bet on. I would like to tell you I have some tidy lesson to leave you with instead. I don't. I only know that I spent my whole life refusing to accept the size everyone else thought I should be. And whatever you decide to make of that, at least now you have heard it from me. That was the story of Napoleon Bonaparte. In his own words, Corsica to St. Helena, start to finish. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments which historical figure you want to see next.